Mesopotamian religion refers to the religious beliefs and practices followed by the Sumerian and East Semitic Akkadian, Assyrian, Babylonian and later migrant Aramaeans and Chaldeans, living in Mesopotamia that dominated the region for a period of 4,200 years from the 4th millennium BCE throughout Mesopotamia to approximately the 10th century CE in Assyria. Mesopotamian polytheism was the only religion in ancient Mesopotamia for thousands of years before entering a period of gradual decline beginning between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE. This decline happened in the face of the introduction of a distinctive native Eastern Christianity as well as Judaism, Manichaeism and Gnosticism, and continued for approximately 3 to 4 centuries, until most of the original religious traditions of the area died out, with the final traces existing among some remote Assyrian communities until the 10th century CE. Reconstruction. As with most dead religions, many aspects of the common practices and intricacies of the doctrine have been lost and forgotten over time. Fortunately, much of the information and knowledge has survived, and great work has been done by historians and scientists, with the help of religious scholars and translators, to reconstruct a working knowledge of the religious history, customs, and the role these beliefs played in everyday life in Sumer, Akkad, Assyria and Babylonia during this time. Mesopotamian religion is thought to have been a major influence on subsequent religions throughout the world, including Canaanite, Aramaean, Ancient Greek, and Phoenician religions, and also monotheistic religions such as Judaism, Christianity, Mandaeism and Islam. It is known that the god Ashur, among others, was still worshipped in Assyria as late as the 4th century CE. Mesopotamian religion was polytheistic, worshipping over 2,100 different deities, many of which were associated with a specific city or state within Mesopotamia, such as Sumer, Akkad, Assyria, Ashur, Nineveh, Uruk, Mari and Babylon. Some of the most significant of these deities were Anu, Enki, Enlil, Ishtar, Ashur, Shamash, Shulmanu, Tammuz, Adad, Hadad, Sin, Ker, Dagon, Ninurta, Nisroch, Nergal, Tiamat, Bel and Marduk. Historians, such as Jean Bottero, have made the claim that Mesopotamian religion is the world's oldest religion, although there are several other claims to that title. However, as writing was invented in Mesopotamia, it is certainly the oldest in written history. What is known about Mesopotamian religion comes from archaeological evidence uncovered in the region, particularly literary sources, which are usually written in cuneiform on clay tablets and which describe both mythology and cultic practices. Other artifacts can also be useful when reconstructing Mesopotamian religion. As is common with most ancient civilizations, the objects made of the most durable and precious materials, and thus more likely to survive, were associated with religious beliefs and practices. This has prompted one scholar to make the claim that the Mesopotamians' entire existence was infused by their religiosity. Just about everything they have passed on to us can be used as a source of knowledge about their religion, although a few isolated pockets in Assyria, Upper Mesopotamia aside, it largely died out by approximately 400 CE. Mesopotamian religion has still had an influence on the modern world, predominantly because many biblical stories that are today found in Judaism, Christianity, Islam and Mandaeism were possibly originally based upon earlier Mesopotamian myths, in particular that of the creation myth, the Garden of Eden, the flood myth, the Tower of Babel and figures such as Nimrod and Lilith. In addition, the story of Moses' origins shares a similarity with that of Sargon of Akkad, and the Ten Commandments mirror Assyrian Babylonian legal codes to some degree. It has also inspired various contemporary neo-pagan groups to begin worshipping the Mesopotamian deities once more, albeit in a way often different from that of the Mesopotamian people themselves. History. The people of Mesopotamia originally consisted of two groups, the East Semitic Akkadians and the Sumerians who spoke a language isolate These people were not originally one united nation, but members of various city-states and small kingdoms. In the 4th millennium BCE, when the first evidence for what is recognizably Mesopotamian religion can be seen with the invention in Mesopotamia of writing circa 3500 BCE, the Sumerians appeared. Although it is not known if they migrated into the area in prehistoric times or whether they were some of the original inhabitants, they settled in southern Mesopotamia, which became known as Sumer, and had considerable influence on the Semitic Akkadian peoples and their culture. The Sumerians were advanced. As well as inventing writing, they also invented early forms of mathematics, early wheeled vehicles, astronomy, astrology, written law, organized medicine, advanced agriculture and architecture, and the calendar. They created the first city-states, nations such as Uruk, Lagash, Ising, Kish, Umma, Eridu, Adab, Akshak, Sippar, Nippur and Lhasa, each of them ruled by a ruler called the Nsi. Akkadian names first appear in king lists of these states circa 2800 BCE. The Sumerians remained largely dominant in this synthesized Sumero-Akkadian culture, however, until the rise of the Akkadian Empire under Sargon of Akkad circa 2335 BCE, which united all of Mesopotamia under one ruler. Gradually, there was increasing syncretism between the Sumerian and Akkadian cultures and deities, with the Akkadians typically preferring to worship fewer deities but elevating them to greater positions of power. Circa 2335 BCE, Sargon of Akkad conquered all of Mesopotamia, uniting the Akkadian and Sumerians in the world's first empire, and spreading its domination into ancient Iran, the Levant, Asia Minor, Canaan, and the Arabian Peninsula. The Akkadian Empire endured for 2 centuries before collapsing due to economic decline, internal strife and attacks from the northeast by the Gutians. Following a brief Sumerian revival with the Neo-Assyrian Empire, Mesopotamia broke up into a number of Akkadian states. Assyria reasserted itself in the north circa 2100 BCE, and southern Mesopotamia fragmented into a number of kingdoms, the largest being Ising, Lhasa and Esnunna. In 1894 BCE, the initially minor city-state of Babylon was founded in the south. Sometime after this, the Sumerians disappeared, becoming wholly absorbed into the Assyro-Babylonian population. Assyrian kings are attested from the late 25th century BCE, and dominated northern Mesopotamia and parts of Asia Minor and northeast Syria. Circa 1750 BCE, the Amorite ruler of Babylon, King Hammurabi, conquered much of Mesopotamia. But this Babylonian empire collapsed after his death due to attacks from mountain-dwelling people known as the Kassites from Asia Minor, who went on to rule Babylon for over 500 years. Assyria, having been the dominant power in the region with the Old Assyrian Empire between the 20th and 18th centuries BCE before the rise of Hammurabi, once more became a major power with the Middle Assyrian Empire. Assyria defeated the Hittite Empire and Mitanni, and its growing power forced the Egyptian Empire to withdraw from the Near East. The Middle Assyrian Empire at its height stretched from the Caucasus to modern Bahrain, and from Cyprus to western Iran. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was the most dominant power on earth and the largest empire the world had yet seen between the 10th century BCE and the late 7th century BCE, with an empire stretching from Cyprus in the west to central Iran in the east, and from the Caucasus Mountains in the north to Nubia, Egypt and Arabia in the south, facilitating the spread of Mesopotamian culture and religion far and wide under emperors such as Ashurbanipal, Tukulti-Ninurta II, Tiglath-Pileser III, Shalmaneser IV, Sargon II, Sennacherib and Esarhaddon. During the Neo-Assyrian Empire, Mesopotamian Aramaic became the lingua franca of the empire, and also Mesopotamia proper. The last written records in Akkadian were astrological texts dating from 78 CE discovered in Assyria. The empire fell in 605 BCE with the death of Ashur-uballit II after a period of internal strife followed by attacks by a coalition of Babylonians, Chaldeans, Medes, Scythians, Persians and Cimmerians. The attacks, which began in 625 BCE, were led by Nabopolassar, the Chaldean ruler of Babylon, who was joined by Cyaxares of Media in 616 BCE after the Medes allied with the Babylonians. Babylon had a brief late flowering of power and influence under the migrant Chaldean dynasty, which took over much of the empire formerly held by their northern kinsmen. However, the last king of Babylonia, Nabonidus, paid little attention to politics, preferring to worship the moon god Sin, leaving day-to-day rule to his son Belshazzar. This and the fact that the Persians and Medes to the east were growing in power now that the might of Assyria that had held them in vassalage for centuries was gone, spelt the death knell for native Mesopotamian power. The Achaemenid Empire conquered the Neo-Babylonian Empire in 539 BCE. Effective Assyrian religious beliefs on its political structure. Like many nations in Mesopotamian history, Assyria was originally, to a great extent, an oligarchy rather than a monarchy. Authority was considered to lie with the city, and the polity had three main centers of power: an assembly of elders, a hereditary ruler, and an eponym. The ruler presided over the assembly and carried out its decisions. He was not referred to with the usual Akkadian term for king, Sarim, that was instead reserved for the city's patron deity Ashur, of whom the ruler was the high priest. The ruler himself was only designated as the steward of Ashur, where the term for steward is a borrowing from Sumerian ensi. The third center of power was the eponym, who gave the year his name, similarly to the archons and consuls of classical antiquity. He was annually elected by lot and was responsible for the economic administration of the city, which included the power to detain people and confiscate property. The institution of the eponym as well as the formula Isiac Ashur lingered on as ceremonial vestiges of this early system throughout the history of the Assyrian monarchy. Religion in the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The religion of the Neo-Assyrian Empire centered around the Assyrian king as the king of their lands as well. However, kingship at the time was linked very closely with the idea of divine mandate. The Assyrian king, while not being a god himself, was acknowledged as the chief servant of the chief god, Ashur. In this manner, the king's authority was seen as absolute so long as the high priest reassured the peoples that the gods, or in the case of the henotheistic Assyrians, the god, was pleased with the current ruler. For the Assyrians who lived in Ashur and the surrounding lands, this system was the norm. For the conquered peoples, however, it was novel, particularly to the people of smaller city-states. In time, Ashur was promoted from being the local deity of Ashur to the overlord of the vast Assyrian domain, which spread from the Caucasus and Armenia in the north to Egypt, Nubia and the Arabian Peninsula in the south, and from Cyprus and the eastern Mediterranean Sea in the west to central Iran in the east. Ashur, the patron deity of the city of Ashur from the Late Bronze Age, was in constant rivalry with the patron deity of Babylon, Marduk. Worship was conducted in his name throughout the lands dominated by the Assyrians. With the worship of Ashur across much of the Fertile Crescent, the Assyrian king could command the loyalty of his fellow servants of Ashur. Later Mesopotamian history. In 539 BCE, Mesopotamia was conquered by the Achaemenid Empire, then ruled by Cyrus the Great. This brought to an end over 3,000 years of Semitic Mesopotamian dominance of the Near East. The Persians maintained and did not interfere in the native culture and religion, and Assyria and Babylon continued to exist as entities. And Assyria was strong enough to launch major rebellions against Persia in 522 and 482 BCE. Then, 2 centuries later in 330 BCE, the Macedonian Greek Emperor Alexander the Great overthrew the Persians and took control of Mesopotamia itself. After Alexander's death, increased Hellenistic influence was brought to the region by the Seleucid Empire. Assyria and Babylonia later became provinces under the Parthian Empire, Rome and Sassanid Empire. Babylonia was dissolved as an entity during the Parthian Empire, though Assyria was to endure. Christianity began to take hold in the 1st century CE, and the independent states of Adiabene, Osron, Ashur, Hatra and Palmyra were largely ruled by converts to Christianity and Judaism. Gnostic sects such as Sabianism and the still extant Mandeanism also became popular, though native religions still existed among the populace. Gods such as Ashur and Sin were still worshipped at least until the 4th century CE. In the 3rd century CE, another native Mesopotamian religion flourished, Manichaeanism, which incorporated elements of Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, and Zoroastrianism, as well as local Mesopotamian elements. The city of Ashur was still populated until the 14th century CE massacre of Assyrian Christians by Tamerlane. There is some evidence to suggest Ashurism was still practiced around Haran as late as the 17th century by tiny minorities of Assyrians. Assyria became a center of a distinctly Mesopotamian Christianity. The Eastern Syrian Rite Christianity, which was spread all over the Near East and as far away as Central Asia, India, Mongolia and China by traveling monks, and still exists as the religion of the Assyrians to this day in the form of the Assyrian Church of the East, Chaldean Catholic Church and Ancient Church of the East. Various Gnostic sects also sprang up, such as Sabianism and Mandeanism, the latter of which also still exists. After the Arab-Islamic conquest in the 7th century CE, Assyria was dissolved. Over the next few centuries, Mesopotamia saw an influx of foreign, non-indigenous and largely Muslim peoples, in particular Arabs, Kurds and Turkic peoples, and indigenous Assyrian Mesopotamian people retaining native ethnicity, culture, customs, religion and language gradually became a minority over the next 7 centuries. This process of marginalization was completed by the massacres of native Assyrians by Tamerlane in the 14th century, after which the city of Ashur was finally abandoned. However, the Neo-Aramaic dialect still survived to this day among the 5% of Mesopotamians that survived the various massacres and resisted Arabization and Islamification. These people exist today as the modern Assyrians, who are wholly Eastern Rite Christian but retain a distinct Mesopotamian language, Neo-Aramaican identity, and the naming of children with ancient names such as Ashur, Shamash, Semiramis, Lamassu, Ninus, Lilithu, Lilith, Sargon, Sharukin, Sennacherib, Hadad etc., is still common. Likewise, months may be named after ancient deities in the Assyrian calendar, i.e., Tammuz. The modern Assyrian calendar is dated back to the traditional founding and dedicating of the city of Ashur to the god of the same name.